Welcome, everyone. I'm A.J. Albanak, the Development Director of the Young Center for Immigrant Children's Rights, and we are so glad that you're able to take time out of your Friday to join us for this webinar. Our goal today is to give you a review of the past several months of our work as child advocates for separated children, an update on the current situation, and to look forward to the future. We want you to understand how powerful the impact of your support is on the vulnerable children we serve every day. So I sit in on conversations each week with Young Center program staff where they discuss their work. And the thing that always strikes me is how tenacious our people are. Our staff attorneys, social workers, and volunteer child advocates, they just do not quit, no matter how many obstacles are placed in front of them in their battles to get these children released to their families. So I'm delighted today for you to get their inside perspective on how the fight is going on the ground. A quick note, in the bottom left corner of your screen, you should have an option to chat, which is where you can submit your questions throughout the presentation. We're going to reserve plenty of time for questions at the end. We will, however, end the webinar promptly at 1 p.m. Central Time. So first off, a quick summary of recent events. Starting in the late spring and early summer of 2017, so that's more than a year ago, the Young Center began receiving referrals to take the cases of children, including those as young as toddlers and babies, who had been separated from their parents at the border. So Young Center staff have worked on parent-child separation cases for all 15 years of our program. But in the past, we only saw separation cases when border officials had reason to doubt the relationship between the parent and child. Suddenly, though, we were seeing cases of children who'd arrived with their mothers and fathers. There were no doubts about the relationship, but DHS was still splitting up the families. And for nearly a year, the administration denied any official policy of separating parents and children at the border. But we could see it. The number of children that were being referred to us for advocacy was increasing every month. And then in the spring of this year, Attorney General Sessions announced a zero-tolerance policy for immigrants found at the border. Under this policy, the Department of Homeland Security started jailing all migrants who entered the U.S. without authorization, even those who arrived with children and even those who were lawfully seeking asylum. The government took children from their parents so the parents could be prosecuted in Texas, Arizona, California, and other border communities. And the children were sent to children's detention facilities across the nation, from Phoenix to as far away as New York, Chicago, and the Washington, D.C. area. By the time the president signed an executive order pausing the separations on June 20th, more than 2,500 children had been taken from their parents. And as everyone paying attention to the news soon discovered, the government had utterly failed to create any system to track the separated families. They had intentionally separated families without having any plan for their reunification. A week later, on June 27th, a federal judge in California ordered all the separated families to be reunited within 30 days. Children under 5 were supposed to be reunited with their parents within 14 days, and the remaining children by the 26th of July. So during all of this time, staff in every Young Center office around the country had been fighting to reunify these children with their parents that they'd been taken from. Our attorneys and social workers spent hours trying to find each child's parents, arranging for phone calls between the children and their parents, and that was often the first contact they'd had in weeks, and finding out what the parents wanted for their children. Still, we were getting far more cases than our staff could accept, and at the same time, we were also getting referrals for all of the children we've traditionally worked with, the unaccompanied children who have been separated from their families long before they arrive at our border by the violence and gang threats and civil unrest in their home countries. Right now, there are more than 12,800 unaccompanied children locked up by the government. At the same time last year, there were fewer than 5,000. These children come to the U.S. without their parents, and during this whole family separation crisis, they still needed our help too. So to respond to all of these challenges, we launched the Child and Family Rights Project, which many of you on this call supported, and this allowed us to dedicate experienced attorneys to focus on family separation cases full time so we could address the unmet need and help many more families reunify. For the next 20 minutes or so, you're going to meet those attorneys and hear about some of the successes that your support made possible, as well as some of the challenges they continue to face with the approximately 250 children who have not yet been reunified. Priscilla Monico Marín has spent more than 5 years as a practicing attorney, and she is now overseeing our parent-child separation cases in New York. And Vanessa Pineda has spent more than 7 years as a practicing attorney, and she is overseeing the parent-child separation cases on the border in Phoenix. After they speak, our policy director, Jennifer Nagda, will give a very brief update on the ever-changing status of these families, including an agreement announced this week. She'll also help you understand how you can fight back against the government's latest effort to lock up children in order to deter migration. And the rest of our time together will be set aside for a Q&A, and we'll do our best to answer as many questions as possible before wrapping up. And now I'm going to turn it over to Vanessa and Priscilla. Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. This is Priscilla Monico Marín. Thank you all so much for joining us this afternoon for this webinar. I'm going to start just to talk more generally about the Young Center's work with reunifying families. At the Young Center, we are appointed to identify and fight for children's best interests. This is our role on cases whether we are appointed to unaccompanied children who arrive here alone or to the children who were separated from their parents by the administration. As AJ said, there's no system in place to track children who are separated from their parents. In almost every case, we've had to spend hours just trying to find the parents and then persuade their detention officers to communicate with us. At the same time, we're meeting with children, we're learning their stories, and we're gathering as much information as we can about their situation. For the children who were separated, we've found that we've had to fight for the most basic things, like ensuring that the children can talk to their parents or get video calls or communications. We've had to fight to show that a parent isn't a threat or a risk to their child. And we've had to fight to get kids released to other family members if their parents are going to be held in immigration detention for prolonged periods. So how do we do this? We submit written briefs to everyone involved in the child's case, from the officials responsible for the children to those responsible for the adults, to persuade them to reunify the families. We also accompany the children to court and make sure the judges know what's going on with their parents' cases. And when the parents need their own attorney, we find pro bono counsel. So for the next several minutes, we're going to talk about 5 different children that Vanessa and I have worked with. And we hope to highlight special challenges these families face and how your support has made all the difference. These are the categories of cases that we're going to talk about. Children left behind when parents were deported, children with special needs, very young children and babies, and children whose parents aren't recognized by immigration authorities as the parent, and children who were reunified with their parents but still risk deportation. And to get us started, my colleague Vanessa is going to talk about children whose parents were deported.
Thanks, Priscilla. Hi, everyone. It's morning here in Phoenix, so good morning and good afternoon to everyone else. But as Priscilla said, we're still working in Phoenix and many of our offices across the country with children whose parents have already been deported. And you'll see on the PowerPoint we have a picture of Central America or the Northern Triangle. And many of the parents that we speak with or have been deported are from this area. And we have more than 400 parents that were deported without their children. And the children are still in custody across the United States, which means much of our work here on these cases is to establish contact with the deported parents, as Priscilla was saying, and in order to assess the child's safety in home country. So we learn what the parents' wishes are, where their location is, within the country, and along that conversation, I sort of think of my safety assessments in 3 parts. The first is to explain my role, who I am as a child advocate, or as we like to say in Spanish, acompañante. And then I also talk to the parents about what was happening in their home country, and then the procedural part of it. So many left the United States because they were misled by government detention officers, and they were told that if they returned to their home country, their children would return even more quickly to them. And it's not until they arrive in their country of origin that they realize that it's not true. So many of my conversations tend to explain the procedural process of the child here in the United States. So I let them know that the child still has to see an immigration judge, much in the same way that they saw immigration judges when they were detained. And then the judge has to give the okay for the child to return. And then even after we go to court, it still may be several more weeks before the child can obtain travel documents from their consulate, and then waiting for the government to purchase a flight home for them. And once we talk about the procedural part of it, and I've explained my role of accompanying the children to court and as they're in the shelter, I tend to hear a lot of appreciation from the parents. They like to know that some responsible adult is attending court with their small children. I have many parents who tell me, please help her with him or her with the questions. If they're so little, they may not understand. And please let the judge know that I want my child back. And I wouldn't have left but for being misled by the government. Along with the safety assessments, I hear many heart-wrenching stories, both of mothers and fathers, that detail how one or both parents have gone into a deep, deep depression out of missing their child. In one particular story, a father told me that his wife was in such a deep depression she couldn't get out of bed and refused to eat until her child was returned to her. Another story was a mother explaining to me that one of her older children passed away in Guatemala while her youngest was detained here in the U.S., and she was distraught because that's the only child she had left in the world, and she wanted her child back as soon as possible. And part of my role during these safety assessments is, of course, if it's in the child's best interest, to reassure the parent that that I'm doing everything that I can to help the child return to them as soon as possible. And I did this in a particular case just recently for Melissa. So Melissa is an 8-year-old girl from Guatemala. She was separated from her father in early June, and her father was very quickly returned to home country by the end of the month, that same month. Now, Melissa and I just went to court last month in August. During my safety assessment with the father by phone, he mentioned that Melissa did not yet know he had been returned to Guatemala. He was afraid that if she knew, she would be extremely sad, lonely, upset, and left behind, abandoned. And so the government workers, along with the parents, had not told Melissa that he had returned. And when Melissa calls home every week, she only speaks to her mother because the father and the government workers are still keeping this information from her. And now, when Melissa and I went to court about a month ago, she had to attend immigration court here in Phoenix so that a judge could give her permission to go back to her country. I was waiting for Melissa in the waiting room, and she walks in with her hair in a very nice braid and this beautiful big white bow just sitting right on top. The courtroom was filled with about 20 to 30 children that were waiting also for their immigration court hearings. And I believe we were there maybe 30 minutes, 45 minutes. We're waiting for her case to be called, and she turns to me in tears. So we walk out of the courtroom, and I sat down next to Melissa, offered her some tissue, and asked her what she was feeling. And she said she was scared. She was listening to the other children have this provide information to the judge, and she was nervous because she couldn't remember the date that she entered the United States. There's a lot to ask an 8-year-old to remember. And I said, don't worry, Melissa. Let's just practice what you do need to know. So I had her practice saying her full name, her age, and her date of birth. And then I said, don't worry if you don't know anything else that the judge asks. That's why you have me, and that's why you have a lawyer. And you can just tell the judge you don't know, and we'll step in and we'll give the judge the information that she needs. So then Melissa and I continued to play with a bit of Play-Doh that I brought. It was bright pink Play-Doh, and I was having her teach me how to make tortillas with a little round Play-Doh. So when the judge finally called her name, we walked back into the courtroom, and the judge complimented her big, beautiful white bow in her hair. Melissa smiled. It took about 10 minutes, and the lawyer essentially requested permission for her to return. I provided the judge with my safety assessment that I had spoken to both parents. There were no safety concerns, and both parents were desperate for her to return. The judge granted voluntary departure, and then Melissa and I walked straight out of the courtroom. The less time she could be in there, the better. And so she seemed completely relieved when it was all over. So Melissa is just one of the children that we worked with over the course of the summer. And I'll now turn it over to Priscilla so that she can tell us about the children that we work with who have special needs.
Thank you so much, Vanessa. So I'm going to talk a little bit about other children that we have worked with who have a range of special needs. And these needs include chronic health conditions, mental health concerns, or developmental delays. In fact, Vanessa recently worked with a 6-year-old girl who was blind and who was separated from her mother when they arrived. Government officials didn't recognize the disability, but Vanessa did when the girl reached out to touch Vanessa's face. And by talking to the mother, Vanessa was able to learn everything that the mom had done to teach her daughter to understand the world around her. Because of Vanessa's meticulous work with the family, we got the child prioritized for immediate release, which is really amazing. And my colleagues in other offices have also worked with children with disabilities like deafness or other medical issues. And our ability to demonstrate how separation exacerbates the underlying medical concern has really helped win faster releases and reunification. I want to talk about Jaime's story because it's a bit of a different situation, and it highlights the brutal consequences of the administration's separation policy. Jaime is a child who just turned 4. He's a bright-eyed boy with curly hair and a happy smile. He loves blowing bubbles. And he's a little boy who's been in government custody since March of this year. Jaime has a severe heart condition, and his father brought him to the U.S. to obtain medical care to save his life. Jaime and his father arrived when the president's zero-tolerance policy was in effect, and they were immediately separated. Jaime's father went to adult detention and was later deported. Jaime remained and still remains in government custody, and he cannot be released to family or be repatriated home until he is medically stable. Believe it or not, this 4-year-old child is scheduled for open heart surgery next week, and I know how important it is for Jaime to be with his parents when facing such a major medical procedure at such a young age. Because of the emergent nature of this case, I recruited the assistance of several other organizations and a large pro bono firm. About 12 to 15 people are now working on this case in total. And together, we have asked that the government grant Jaime's parents what is called humanitarian parole. Humanitarian parole would allow Jaime's parents to come to the U.S. temporarily for his surgery and recovery. Over the last couple of days, it's been a whirlwind. We've assisted the family in securing passports in home country, and I've also secured funding for mom and dad's flights, temporary housing here in New York, and even cash assistance for food while they're here. And though we are waiting to hear back from the government, we're very hopeful that our advocacy will pay off. And if successful, we will be one of the first known cases where a parent has been allowed to return to the U.S. after having been separated and deported. So we are very hopeful about Jaime's case, and we certainly wish him a speedy recovery, and we'll have to stay tuned with that case to see what happens next. I'm now going to pass it back over to my colleague, Vanessa. She's going to talk about children who are very, very young, as well as toddlers that are in government custody.
Thanks, Priscilla. At the Young Center, we've always believed that children are vulnerable, whether when they're in government custody, whether that's because they're unaccompanied or they were taken from their parents. But children under 12 have always been required a particular attention and care. And when we review referrals in our office and across all of our offices, we always prioritize those cases. And after the ACLU filed the lawsuit to stop family separations, the judge overseeing the case determined that the youngest children should be prioritized for immediate reunification. The only issue was that he, of course, had a very low age limit, and it was children under the age of 5. At the time, more than 100 children under the age of 5, children even too young to go to kindergarten, were separated from their parents. And today, we still have several children under the age of 5 and several dozen children under the age of 12 that remain in government custody. And that could be for various reasons. Their parents haven't been located, or the government refuses to reunify the families, claiming that it's unsafe for the children. And it's every case varies, and we are fighting our hardest on these cases. And when we get success on the infant and toddler cases, it's even more of a sigh of relief that we've been able to make a difference in these particular cases. So now I'd like to tell you about the Israel siblings. Their mother, Veronica Israel, entered the United States with 4 young sons, all under 12, but the youngest was 6 months old. She was fleeing violence and threats in their home country. At the time Veronica entered the United States, she was breastfeeding Joseph, the 6-month-old baby. And when they're ripped apart from each other, I later learned in conversations with Veronica's mother, the boy's grandmother, how painful it really was for Veronica to abruptly stop breastfeeding. Now the family's reunified, so we had a happy ending, but she was no longer able to produce milk. Joseph and Veronica will never be able to recover that bonding time between a mother and an infant son. And it was never Veronica's choice. The government made that decision for her of when she should stop breastfeeding. The physical and emotional pain that Veronica suffered is inexplicable, and yet the family is resilient and strong, and luckily all 4 boys were kept together in the same government program here in Phoenix, except for Joseph, the 6-month-old. While he's still at the same facility, he was placed in a different area of the shelter, the infant daycare. And so even though the brothers were technically on the same campus, he's apart with government workers that were taking care of him 24 hours a day, but also bottle feeding him to allow him to eat. In my advocacy for these siblings, I also advocated for the mother. So I had several phone calls with Veronica while she was detained in Texas. I also had contact with Veronica's mother, the boy's grandmother, and she was residing in L.A. Or near L.A. I had contact with Veronica's attorneys. Her attorneys were pro bono attorneys traveling from Boston. So it almost felt like I was working all around the country, even though I was based here in Phoenix. But we were advocating together. So my best interest recommendation that I drafted to keep the brothers not just together, but to reunify them with their mom was helpful to Veronica's attorneys so that they could help get her out of detention. Veronica was one of the families that were reunified because of the court order in early July. So once she was released and brought to Arizona to reunify with their children, Veronica's mother in California called me to say that they were all together. Veronica had been brought extremely early in the morning, and the boys were picked up from the government shelter, I believe it was around 6 a.m., to what you may have seen in the news, to the government hieleras, very cold rooms, and the family's together. But Grandma says, listen, she told me she's been there since 6 a.m. It's now 1 o'clock in the afternoon, and they don't have any diapers. She doesn't have any formula to give the baby. Of course, she can't breastfeed, and so panicked, she called me, and I said, I'll take care of it. Don't worry. Immediately picked up the phone and called local government deportation officers here in Phoenix and inquired about the family and let her know that I had heard that they did not have any diapers or milk. A bit later, I called the grandma back to see if she'd heard anything from Veronica, and she confirmed that she had been provided the diapers and milk after my call. It just continued at that. We were finally able to help Grandma purchase a Greyhound bus ticket. The advocacy in this case was it was really filling the gaps, and even if that required me to jump on the Greyhound website to help Grandma get all the tickets that she needed, we did that, and they made it safe, and they're all together now in California. I've had posts. We still support the family now because I've had conversations with them on how to enroll the children in school and continue to support them from Phoenix. We'll talk a little bit more about our advocacy after we finish with the reunification in a bit. But for now, I'll turn it over to Priscilla, who's also been working with an infant child but has a much different story and different points of advocacy that Priscilla has worked on.
Thanks so much, Vanessa. So I'm going to spend some time talking about children who were separated when the government disagrees about who is the parent or who is a parent. At the Young Center, we have been appointed to several cases where a child arrived with someone who has acted as their parent since birth, but who are not their biological parents. Some of you may have followed the PBS NewsHour story of a child taken from her grandmother who had been legally designated her legal guardian in Mexico. We have seen many similar cases. In fact, just this week, we learned of a case involving a child separated from her two mothers, and the government is refusing to release the child to either mother. For these children, the separation from the person they love and trust the most is no less harrowing than the experience of a child taken from a biological parent. I'd like to tell you a little bit about Darwin's story. It involves a child who's been separated, and it's a case where we are still advocating for release and reunification. Darwin came to the United States with his adoptive legal father at the age of 1. As of today, Darwin has been separated from his father for 135 days. Darwin's father and mother were Darwin's primary caretakers since his birth. Darwin's father has loved him, he's cared for him unconditionally, and he's been there the whole time since Darwin was born. Darwin's mother even reports that Darwin is extremely close to his father, even closer to his father than he is to her. Unfortunately, Darwin and his dad arrived during the president's zero-tolerance policy and were separated. Though Darwin's father is listed as his legal father on his birth certificate, the government refused to recognize him as a family member after a DNA test indicated that they are not biologically related. I advocated fiercely with the government. I filed numerous briefs recommending that the government recognize Darwin's father as his parent so that the two could be reunified. After some time, between 1 and 2 months, several phone calls and several briefs, the government finally acknowledged the parentage and then changed its tune and began relying on another rationale to justify prolonged separation. A misdemeanor plea from 8 years ago, 6 years before Darwin's birth. The government continues to rely on just about anything to keep families apart. Today, Darwin remains separated from his father, and the government has provided Darwin's father with no access to his son, either through phone calls, video chats, or visits. And we are continuing to advocate for the family's reunification because we know that Darwin is suffering a great deal. Just as of yesterday, we filed an updated recommendation indicating that we do not believe that the misdemeanor is is an example or is indicative of the fact that his dad poses any risk to his son whatsoever. Darwin is an adorable child, but he's an extremely confused 2-year-old toddler who has not been with either of his parents for 5 months. And he's trying to cope. He's trying to make sense of his life in government custody, and he just doesn't understand why he can't be with his family. And we're hopeful that with continued advocacy, we will successfully be able to reunify this little one with his dad very soon. Vanessa is going to finish us off by talking a little bit about children who have been reunified but are still at risk of deportation.
Right. So as I was mentioning with the case of the 4 brothers, the process of releasing families was and continues to be chaotic. Even when we overcome the hurdles of finding a place to live, as their case proceeds, they face more challenges. They still have to file multiple forms with different federal agencies to make sure the government knows where they're living. Families need to find attorneys. Sometimes it's one attorney for the parent, one attorney for the child. And so we play a critical role in finding counsel for families we work with. Just as the parents have to continue to meet deadlines, appointments, and hearings with government officials, so do the children. And I worked with Rita to do this. Rita's a 4-year-old girl from Guatemala that was separated from her father for more than 120 days. Rita and her dad were reunified in early July, after that court order, but neither Rita or her father knew how or where or when the reunification would happen. Fortunately, I had been in contact with Rita's uncle and had been in constant contact with him and learned that they would be released to him, and that he had already purchased a Greyhound ticket for them. And that day in July, my colleagues here in Phoenix and I traveled to the Greyhound station to meet with them and other families. We provided them with fresh fruit, water, snacks, crayons, and coloring books so that Rita could be entertained while she had a very long bus ride to Illinois from Phoenix. About 2 weeks after their arrival in Illinois, the dad called me because he realized that Rita was scheduled for court in Phoenix. And it was actually that same week of her court hearing on a Friday morning. Rita's dad called me in a panic, and he said, I've called around, and I just learned that Rita has court on Friday, and it's going to cost me $3,000 to take a taxi from Illinois to Phoenix. And I quickly reassured him, there's no need to worry. We have a very amenable judge here in Phoenix, and I plan to attend the hearing even though Rita was no longer in the state. And even though she was reunified with her dad, I knew that I still had to be present in court to appear on her behalf as a child advocate. And I reassured the dad that there would be no issue with Rita or him not being in Phoenix that day. He said, okay, let me know how it goes. I'll call you right after court. And I said, of course, no worries. So I went to court that Friday morning here in Phoenix, and I was the only adult in the room that knew the information on the case. The attorneys that had helped children at the shelter, including Rita, had no information about her release, and this was because the agency that reunified the children failed to give the information to the government workers at the shelter that the children were staying at. Also, the government attorney, so the attorney on the other side, had no idea that the child had been reunified with her father. Even though the attorneys working within the same agency, there's so little communication and so much confusion with the court orders and the releases that they had no idea why the child wasn't in court. So I provided the judge with the information that I had, let him know that I was in contact with both the parent and the child, and provided him with the information that, the father and the child were no longer living in the state of Arizona, but that we were working with them and wanted to provide the information that the parties needed in order to get Rita's case transferred to the closest court in Illinois, which would be Chicago. And had it not been for my presence that day, or had we been in front of any other immigration judge in the country, that child would have been ordered deported for not appearing at her hearing. And so this is just one of the ways we continue to help after families have been reunified. Our advocacy doesn't end abruptly and at the moment, the moment parent and child are together. It continues by phone calls and it continues long distance. But now that you've heard a little bit about the children and families that we've been working with over the summer, I'll turn it over to Jennifer to give us an overview of the latest news on family separation.
Thank you, Vanessa. So I'm Jennifer Nagda. I am the policy director here at the Young Center. I've been a part of the Young Center for more than 10 years. Our cases have always been challenging, but we have never experienced anything quite like this. These family separations that Vanessa and Priscilla have described and that you have helped us to fight did not occur in a vacuum. They happened as part of an organized and relentless campaign to weaken or to just eliminate legal protections for immigrant children and their families. At the same time that the administration was ripping children from their parents, it also changed policies to make it harder for unaccompanied children, those who come here alone, to be released to their parents here in the U.S. who were waiting for them or who sent for them to get them out of harm's way. During the same spring and summer, the administration took steps to speed up deportations of both adults and children, and then the Attorney General took the extraordinary step of attempting to wipe out asylum for children and families who are fleeing gang persecution or domestic violence from the very countries where governments simply can't protect their own children. Most recently, the administration announced its plan to eliminate a 20-year-old legal agreement between the government and children's lawyers known as the Flores Settlement. The Flores Settlement was created to keep children out of immigration detention and to ensure that any time in government custody is brief and is safe. Before that agreement existed, children in federal custody faced terrible conditions. Lawyers had to go to court to make sure that the government provided children with 3 meals a day, time for rest, exercise, education, even the right to practice their religion. But this administration wants to throw out that agreement so that it can detain children and their families indefinitely with no court oversight of its practices. We know this is dangerous. Even brief periods of detention can cause trauma and long-term mental health risks for children, even if they are locked up with their families. It's also a complete conflict of interest to ask the same agency that is trying to throw the children and families out of the country to provide them with developmentally appropriate family-based care. So in the weeks and months that come, you can count on us to do a couple of things here at the Young Center. First, we will continue to be working with these children, fighting to get them reunified. We are appointed to additional cases every week, and we'll be using the evidence that attorneys like Vanessa and Priscilla develop to persuade the government to reunify the children they've refused to reunify to date and any children who are separated moving forward. We'll also be fighting the government's plan to detain families indefinitely. We're working with organizations across the country to develop a legal response to the government's proposal. We're also working to spread the message that indefinite detention of families is not a legitimate alternative to family separation. We'll be posting various tools to social media to help our supporters and the public keep the spotlight on this threat to children. But I really did want to try and end on a hopeful note, and so I would direct your attention to this slide. This image is one of several pages of a comic strip created by a New York 8th grader, Sasha Matthews, whose work can be found at Rumble Comics. Sasha, whose work has been recognized all over the place, including by the Malala Foundation, heard about the mother and child whose separation sparked national outrage over the government's policy. Over several weeks this summer, she worked with a group of experts across the country, including the Young Center, to better understand the legal system for immigrant kids and their families so that she could help tell their stories to a new audience. I'm convinced, both after seeing this and after speaking with Sasha, that with kids like her on our side, we have every reason to be hopeful that we will eventually have a fairer and more just system for immigrant children and families who come here seeking protection. And this week we took a modest but important step in the right direction. The government agreed just this week to allow some parents and children who were separated under the policy we've been discussing to seek asylum here, even if they have returned to home country. That may seem fairly straightforward, and it ought to be, but until this time, the government had persisted in an argument that none of these children or families were eligible for asylum and that they could be deported at any moment, even after they had just been reunified. There are really no small victories these days, and even if these were good times, this would be considered a pretty big win. But there is still a lot of work to do and a lot of families to support. And so we will keep at it and keep fighting and turn it over to you to see what questions you all have and how our staff can help with those. And I am opening up the box of questions that have been submitted so far. The first is whether or not the government is still separating parents from children or whether family separations will happen again. So I will throw that first to Vanessa and Priscilla to hear what they are seeing on the ground, and then I can let you know what we're seeing from a policy perspective. Vanessa or Priscilla?
Sure, this is Priscilla. I'm happy to jump in. So what we're seeing is that children are still being separated when the government identifies what they consider to be any safety risk. Oftentimes what we have found is that the safety risk that the government is using to substantiate separation is not one that we believe rises to the level that would warrant separation. And what we're also seeing is that the kids that are separated are remaining separated unless we're really vigorously advocating for their release and reunification. So we've still seen quite a bit of issues, either children that were not identified as separated during the initial reunification cycles that should have been, or children that are being separated because the government is relying upon what they believe or what they are indicating is a safety risk that really isn't.
And this is Vanessa. I'll just add on the bright side, we're not seeing as many small children, and so that infants and toddlers that we were seeing earlier this summer. So the numbers there have definitely decreased, and the facilities here locally in Phoenix, at least, had to expand or make more than one daycare at certain facilities. Those are now going back to 12 and over classrooms instead of daycares.
And this is Jennifer speaking again. I have a bit of a reputation as bad news Jennifer around the Young Center, so I'll weigh in with the bad news, which is that I've been speaking with our colleagues who work in offices in Texas, including San Antonio, where we have yet another staff person who is part of this Child and Family Rights Project, a social worker, as well as our team in Harlingen, Texas. And we are in those offices again starting to see children who've been separated from their parents. The government will say that it is not part of a formal policy, that the president's executive order remains in place, but they are finding reasons in individualized cases to separate parents from children. We are working to get to the root of what those reasons are and why the families are being separated rather than being kept together and either released or transferred to family detention sites. So I don't think any of us thought we were entirely out of the woods when the president signed the executive order, and I think we're seeing now that after there's been a couple of weeks of quiet around the separation itself and more attention on the reunifications of the kids in custody, we are seeing the numbers creeping up again. What I can say is that everyone is prepared, from the child advocates in our program to the lawyers working with parents and kids, and we remain hopeful that we'll be ready to respond both on individual cases but also as a community of advocates. We have Another question, which I'll read aloud from Liz. We've seen several news articles today about the number of children in government custody has increased substantially because they are not being released to sponsors, and that this is caused by the government requiring fingerprinting of sponsors, thus deterring would-be sponsors. Is there something the Young Center is doing to combat this policy? Great observation, Liz. And I can start to address that and then ask if Priscilla and Vanessa want to add anything else. So we have absolutely at the Young Center witnessed an increasing length of stay of the children in care that we work with, both separated children and far more commonly the unaccompanied children who came here intending to reunify with a family member. The family member may be a parent, it may be another relative, it may be a close friend of the family. And for 20 plus years, as a result of that Flores Settlement agreement that I mentioned earlier, children can be released to parents and family members because we know it is better for children to be in homes with family in the community as their legal cases proceed rather than being locked up. There has always been a process for evaluating the safety of those sponsors, and certain sponsors do have to get fingerprinted. All sponsors have to present identity information to confirm their relationship. But earlier this year, the government entered into an agreement in which it intends that the custodial agency that is caring for the children and that is supposed to be looking out for their safety has agreed in writing to turn over all of the detailed information provided by those family members to the immigration law enforcement entity. This is intended to make it possible for law enforcement on the immigration side to more easily go after and apprehend those family members, including parents, and it is intended, we believe, to deter sponsors from stepping forward. And we know it will result in children spending much longer periods of time in custody. And so it is once again this conflation of the child care aspect with the law enforcement aspect of immigration that is causing problems. We are hard at work protesting this both on individual cases where we are trying to either prevent the disclosure of information or find appropriate sponsors who will not be put at risk in stepping forward. But on the policy level as well, this is something that is being set out for public comment. It's a legal process under administrative law, and we are submitting formal comments, and we are working in coordination with other children's rights groups. So we are working aggressively to respond to this new policy. I don't know how particularly optimistic we are about winning in terms of direct engagement with the government, but we are hoping that as people become more sensitized to the issue of children spending prolonged periods in detention, we will generate some of the public outrage against this issue as we have against family separation and family detention. Priscilla and Vanessa, is there anything you want to add about what you've seen with children facing prolonged waits?
I can jump in because I have a recent case actually where this is happening, and the child's 17 will be turning 18 at the end of the month. And so on the ground, I've had to come up with, while we wait for policy to change, a backup alternative to get her out of the facility when she turns 18. And so here I've had to engage the assistance of the attorneys, but advocating because of the fingerprints and where this child would have been reunified with her father in about a week, sometime last year. At this time, she would have left the facility already. Now I'm working to find a workaround to get her out when she turns 18 with the government deportation officer. So at least in Phoenix, we have some options, but that's not happening everywhere. And so this is still a real issue. And then we have all the other small children that are not going to turn 18 and will be lingering in detention, as Jennifer was saying.
Thanks, Priscilla. I'm going to we had a question from Glennon and then from Sarah, and then David, we have not forgotten about you. We'll get to your question because it'll provide a nice segue to how we're going to wrap up. Glennon, I'm so glad you're on, and you asked if we could talk a little bit about that. Some of the detention facilities that are both growing in size are also exempt from child welfare inspection. So it's a terrific question, and hopefully many of you have seen the news that the government has issued a contract for a facility that will house 3,800 children at one time in soft-sided tent facilities. Vanessa and our policy associate Ursula will actually be heading out there in 10 days to view, inspect the facility and report back to us and help us submit a report to the government about just what we think of that facility. When I started doing this work, we used to write long advocacy pieces protesting 90, 100, and 150 bed facilities, which we thought were outrageously large to house children. And then we found ourselves several years ago protesting 500 bed facilities for children. And now we find ourselves in what really seems to be a surreal situation of talking about 3,800 bed facilities for children. And so, yes, we will most certainly be pushing back against these facilities. I think one of the things that worries us most is that in the proposed policy that the government announced 2 weeks ago, they announced a clear intention and desire to self-regulate and self-license. And by getting themselves out of court agreements and the requirement to license the facilities for families that are being detained together, they really want to keep all external eyes out of these facilities. And that's a real concern. The family detention facilities that exist right now have been subject to numerous complaints and inspections. The government's own advisory panel that evaluated the existing family detention facilities that were subject to some licensing requirements found that they were not appropriate placements for children. And so the idea that we would have these massive facilities that have limited or no oversight by courts and potentially no oversight by states are deeply, deeply concerning. So I thank you for raising that issue, Glennon. And then Sarah, you raised the terrific question of, is there anything we can do to help besides continuing to call our representative and supporting organizations that do this work? So please keep calling your senators and representatives. And we frequently, when there is an issue that merits attention on the Hill, we post to our social media. Lots of other groups do as well and give you links to call. But I really do think that keeping these issues alive in public discussion matter a lot. And I think things that you can do, at top of the list, I would put expressing your opinions in the local press, and specifically through letters to the editor, whether they're online or in the print version. I think in any community where people are still engaged with their local news, having the opportunity to raise these issues, to keep them front and center, to remind people that the issue of attacks on children haven't gone away. So yes, a policy of separating parents and children has ended, but now they're talking about locking them all up together indefinitely with no court review. Those conversations need to keep happening so that we can keep generating the same attention. For those of you who are active on social media has been an extraordinary tool to educate and inform and to engage with younger people and people across the country. So I would encourage you to leverage both of those resources. Priscilla, Vanessa, AJ, I don't know if you want to add anything to that, but I'll throw out there David's question and maybe suggest that AJ come back on and join us in answering this, which is what local initiatives can be undertaken to support the Young Center's work, even in communities that are farther away from the border or places where families, children, or adults are locked up. So I would certainly say to do a little investigating around your community to find out if there is a facility. If there are children's detention facilities, then you can volunteer with the Young Center, become trained as a child advocate, and be assigned to work one-on-one with individual children. It obviously helps if you speak Spanish or a second language. And we work with kids from all over the world, not just kids from Central America, and we can put all sorts of language skills to good use. But obviously that doesn't get to everyone. There are adult detention facilities in many places as well. And while we are not there, those facilities most certainly could benefit from having more volunteers going in to volunteer and spend time when permissible with the adults there. And there are very often religious organizations that organize all sorts of opportunities to engage with the people who are detained there. But AJ, perhaps I can turn it over to you to talk about other ways to engage.
Thank you, Jennifer. And a lot of what I would say would just reiterate your points. We have at the Young Center seen an explosion of support, which is tremendously gratifying in the past several months. Of course, it is caused by this awful crisis, and that is just tragic. But seeing the number of people who both subscribe to our newsletter for action alerts and updates on policy, seeing the number of people who follow us on social media on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram, and we're going to pop up a slide so that everyone can see where those social media accounts are. We've more than doubled our followers and our subscribers on all of those venues to get information. And so if you are someone who does engage in activity on social media or who discusses these issues with your friends and family and colleagues personally in your daily life, you can get regular updates from us on the developments, both at the policy level and on Young Center program developments. We are right now in the midst of a very significant expansion at all 8 of our regional offices across the nation. We are adding program staff and policy staff so that we will be able to better meet the need in all locations. We currently have wait lists of cases that have been referred to us at every single office, and our goal is to reduce those wait lists as much as humanly possible by increasing our staff. The fact that we are able to do this expansion right now is entirely due to the support that we have received from those of you on this call, the additional foundations and corporations and individual donors. We are tremendously grateful for that support, and it will be, I think, very impressive to see the increased capacity for work that we're going to have in all of our offices over the next year as we ramp up to the full staffing that we'll have by the end of 2019. You can follow and get updates on that expansion and continue to get information from us on what you can do in your communities on an educational and volunteer level and on a fundraising level too. And we are always available for any questions that you have. You can find contact for all of us on the website on our contact page, whether it's info@theyoungcenter.org or media contact at media@theyoungcenter.org, or reaching out to the development office where we can always give you updates on what we're doing on a fundraising end and where we're going in the future. Jennifer, do we have any other questions that we want to address before we wrap this up in the next 2 minutes?
Those were all the questions. Thanks so much, AJ, and thank you everybody for the really thoughtful questions and your engagement.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, everyone who's been attending. We're really grateful that you made the time on this Friday, and thank you for being on our side in this fight to continue to preserve immigrant children's rights. And have a terrific weekend. Thank you all.